In today's video, we're going to be using Jenkins and Docker Compose to deploy to Amazon ECS. Are you new here? If you are, welcome. And if you are new here, you don't know who I am. My name is Darren Pope, and I'm a developer advocate for CloudBees. You might be familiar with Amazon's ECS, that's the Elastic Container Service. Now, you may have played with it some in the past, and when starting to work with it, you were going, man, this is really hard. With Docker Compose, we can actually make building and deploying to Amazon ECS as simple as 1, 2, 3. Let's talk about where we're starting from today. I have a Jenkins LTS controller version 2.289.1. When it was created, I used install suggested plugins. I also installed one more plugin, and that plugin is the AWS Credentials plugin. If you haven't seen the previous video about AWS Credentials, look right up here and you can go watch that right now. Now for the agent today, I'm using something a little bit different if you've been watching previous videos. I am using a Mac OS based client. Since this Mac OS agent is new to this series of videos, let's go in and take a look at how it's currently configured. Let's go down to our agent. And we'll take a look at the configuration. Now, one thing that I had to do before I could even connect this as an agent was I had to go into my system preferences and go down to sharing and enable remote login. Otherwise, when I tried to SSH from my Jenkins controller into the Mac, it would not connect. So first off, system preferences, sharing, and enable remote login. Now, what permissions you want to set up and how you should set those up, I'll let you figure that out for yourself, because that could be different for every environment. Mine is, I'm just using my ID, and that's the one that's allowed to make the connection. So as we're taking a look at this configuration, most everything looks pretty normal. My user home directory is users dpope, and underneath that, I created a remote root directory of agent1234. It could be anything. I just didn't want the files to be in the root of my home directory. So the credentials that I'm using are my credentials, which starts with dpope, and then I have a password. And I'm just making sure that agent1234 is on the right place. Give it a label of Mac OS, doesn't really matter. And we're launching via SSH. These credentials that I'm using right here to log in are the credentials that I would typically log into my Mac using. So I'd say dpope and whatever my password is. And finally, I had to do something a little different here. I had to modify the environment variables because if you were to take a look at path, it does not include user local bin. But if you were to take a look at Docker on my Mac, and this shell is for Mac, if I do a which Docker, it is in user local bin. So when I did not have this path prepended to the normal path, I wasn't able to find the Docker binary. So by just simply adding the path here and then making this change to the value, I'm able to run a job and call Docker directly. Your environment may be different, so don't start with path. Try it first without. If you have a problem and it's not able to find Docker, this could be the problem. One last thing, let's take a look at Docker info on my Mac. So when we type in Docker info, we have both a client and a server section. What I'm more concerned with at the moment is this plugin for Docker Compose. And it's currently version 2.0.0 beta 3 at the time of recording. Now let's take a look at a repository that we're going to be using today for our example application. So we're going to go up here to GitHub. You can look this up. The link for this is going to be down below, but it's on GitHub and it's Java Web App. Now the branch that we're using today is Docker-Compose. There are a couple of other branches in this repository, but for this video, we're only taking a look at Docker-Compose. So since this is a Docker Compose based application, we have a compose.yaml file. And it's very basic. It's services, web, the image. This is the image that we're going to be pulling. The context, it's going to build it if the image doesn't exist. And then we're just exposing the ports 8080. This application is a Spring Boot application, so the default port is 8080. So just to keep it simple, we're just exposing the 8080s here by default. Also, since this is a Docker-based application, let's go take a look at our Dockerfile. Now, this Dockerfile is a multi-stage Dockerfile. So in the top section, we're just getting our build part done. And then finally, the actual image that will be built and used and ran is basically lines 15 through 21. Before we go any further, remember that change I made to my path? Let's go run a Jenkinsfile real quick just to make sure that we're actually able to interact with both Docker and Docker Compose. Now, I actually have two different Jenkinsfiles in this branch. I have a Jenkinsfile 1 and a Jenkinsfile 2. So we'll take a look at Jenkinsfile 1, which is going to be the one that we're going to use right now. We have pipeline agent labeled Mac OS, and then we're just going to run a Docker version and a Docker Compose version. So let's go test this out real quick. Let's go back over here to our controller. Let's create a new item called Java Web App, and we'll call this Docker-Compose. We'll click on Pipeline, click OK. And now let's pipeline script from SCM, change it to Git. Let's go get our repository URL from here. Head back over here, paste that in. We're going to change our branch from master to Docker Compose. And finally, we're going to change our script path from just Jenkinsfile to Jenkinsfile-1. We're not doing anything real here other than just making sure that Docker and Docker Compose are visible and doing what we expect. So we'll click on Save, and we'll do a build now. As that starts to run, let's see what happens here. So our tooling version, so Docker version gives us 2010.7, which is the correct version, and our Docker Compose version is the 2.0.0 beta 3, which is what we saw earlier when we did our Docker info directly on the agent. So now that we know that we have both Docker and Docker Compose installed correctly on our agent, let's go over and take a look at the documentation on Docker to figure out the other things that we need to have in order to be able to use Docker Compose to integrate with ECS. And the link for this documentation is down below in the description, and it's called Deploying Docker Containers on ECS. So here are the prerequisites. You need to have the latest version of Docker Desktop on both Mac or Windows. There is a way to do it with Docker Compose CLI for Linux, but today we're doing it on the Mac. You also have to have an AWS account. Sort of makes sense because we're deploying to Amazon ECS. Now, what are the requirements to deploy to ECS? Well, there are a lot of permissions that are required. You can see a full explicit list here of the different roles that are required for your credentials to have. Now, the credentials that I have these permissions. So I know these are already set up for me. If you're just testing this out for yourself, you might need some other permissions, especially if you're using GPU support, so you'll have to do that. So this is an exercise for you to go through and figure out, okay, what are the credential roles that I need to have? Or not necessarily the roles, but the permissions. Let's get down to the second section here. We have to create an AWS context. And what we're going to run is a Docker context create ECS, and then you just give it a name. And we'll use this name just so we can follow the example. Now, normally, if you're going to be doing this by hand on a machine, you would be using the AWS profile or credentials in some way, shape, or form. Since our long-term goal here is to actually run a job, we're going to be using credentials, and that's the reason why the AWS Credentials plugin was installed. We're going to be using those credentials from that AWS credentials type to feed the information into Docker. So we'll create a context in just a few minutes. Then we run a Compose application. We can specify a context, or we can set up a Docker context use context. We're going to do this, and you'll see this after a while. And that's pretty much it. That's all we're going to worry about at the moment. Now, before we actually get into the Jenkins sides of things, what we're going to do is we're going to run this locally and make sure that it works. And then we will go one step further and create the Jenkins file to actually run and deploy this application. To get started, let's go back over to our shell. Again, this is my Mac, so I'm connected directly onto my Mac. If we take a look at it here, I am in my Java web app and I am on my Docker Compose branch. So what we're going to do first is I'm just going to run a Docker Compose up-d. And what's going to happen is it's going to go through, it's going to build the image, and then it's going to go ahead and start the image up into a container so I'm able to run it and interact with it on my machine. So let's give this just a couple of seconds to run. And we're back. And let's make sure that it's actually running. So we'll say Docker compose PS. And we can see that the application is running, and it's running on port 8080. Let's go ahead and just do a quick curl against this. So HTTP localhost 8080. And we get a hello world response. So this is what I expect the application to be. In fact, if we want to take a quick look at that, we'll go back over to the application. We'll go to source, main, Java, demo application. And you can see that the root mapping just returns hello world. Now, in order to stop the application, what we're going to run is a Docker compose down. Whoops, I did not spell that correctly. Docker compose down. So now it's shutting everything down, and we wait for that to complete, and now it's done. If we want to verify that, Docker compose PS, and we can see it's completely down. Let's take a look at the images real quick. Docker images, we can see there's the image that was built about a minute ago. So we know everything worked as expected. We know it runs correctly on this Mac. Now, here's the thing to remember. This Mac is going to be my agent. So there's going to be some things that we do right now. We're just verifying that everything works at least by hand. So we know that, okay, Docker's set up correctly. We can run Docker compose up. It serves what we expect. We can do Docker compose down. We see the images. And in fact, what we want to do is completely wipe out our images and any of the old containers from here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a Docker system prune and clean everything out. So now there's no images, no containers, no volumes, no networks. It's all been wiped out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do a Docker compose build to build our image to get it ready to push up to Docker Hub. Because what we're going to be using is we're going to be using the image from Docker Hub to feed Amazon ECS. So what we're going to do is a Docker compose build. And let's give this just a couple of seconds. And now we've completed the build, so far so good. In fact, let's just verify that. Docker images, and there's the image. Now we're ready to go ahead and do a push to Docker Hub. Now, how are we going to do that? We're going to stick with Docker compose push, but if I do that right now, we're getting a requested access to the resources denied. So that means we're not logged in to Docker Hub. So let's see what we need to do here. First off, it's really simple. We need to do a Docker login. I'm going to log in with my Docker ID, which is also Darren Pope. And let me grab my password for that. And just to verify that we're actually logged in, I'm going to run Docker login one more time. And it's authenticating with existing credentials, so we're good. So now let's run that Docker compose push one more time. So now we're pushing up. Layers already existed for some of these. I've done this a few times. And we've pushed. We're waiting on the last one. And it should be done now. Okay, good. So now what we've done is we've done a Docker compose build. We did a Docker compose push. So now the latest version of this image is living up on Docker Hub. Now let's go back to the prerequisites that we needed to do. We need to create an ECS context. So let's take a look and see what contexts we do have. So we'll say Docker context ls. And right now there's just a default context, which is for our local Docker host that's running. Not real surprising. Let's go ahead and create our context. I'm adding one more thing. Actually, I'm going to wait for that one thing just for a moment. Let's put this in. And it asks us, which do you want to use? Do you want to use an existing AWS profile? Do you want to use secret token credentials? Or do you want to use environment variables? Now, thinking ahead towards when we're running this in Jenkins, we want to use environment variables. But what I don't want to do right now is go through and have to do that interactively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do if we do a Docker context ls, we can see that my ECS context is there. I'm actually going to delete that real quickly and show you a shorter way to do that. So now if we take another look at our LS, we're down to the 1. Now what we want to do is add one more switch, and that is from E and V. So if you remember, it asked us which one of these 3 do you want to use, and we said from environment variables. This -- from -E and V is that same item. So instead of being interactive, now it's created. So if we take a look at the LS, now we have both contexts there. Let me clear this out. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and switch to that context. So we're going to say Docker context use my ECS context. Okay, we're switched over. Let's verify and see what that looks like. When I try to list the context, you can see the context requires credentials to be passed as environment variables. So what I need to do now is set up 2 environment variables that are used for my AWS credentials. So let's see that set up here real quick. And you will see real credentials here. These will be deleted by the time you see this video. So these credentials are no good for you. Okay. So there's my access key and my secret key. If you've done any kind of work with AWS, these are 2 specific environment variables that are used for AWS credentials. Let's run our context ls one more time. Now we can see that the my ECS context is selected with this little star and is now what is considered the active context. So we've set up the context, we've got our credentials in so things work. Let's go ahead and do a Docker compose up. Now, since this Docker compose up is going to be talking with ECS, we don't need a -d because the -d is really for just the local, or in this case, the default context. But right now, the context we're using is my ECS context. So we'll say Docker compose up. And what you're going to see here is the account has no default VPC. We need to set the VPC to deploy to by using this one attribute. Now, this is sort of weird, but not really. My AWS account does not have a default VPC. So I have to specify what VPC do I want this to run in. But I do have a VPC available. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change to my compose YAML to add this value for X AWS VPC. Now I'm here, so let's go ahead and just use VI because it's a simple change. Compose YAML. So now that we're in our compose YAML, what we're going to do is insert our value here. So any of these extra X-AWS, just stack those at the top right above services. That'll work. So this is my VPC ID. Let's go ahead and save this. And then finally, let's run our Docker compose up one more time. What we will see here is that all of the infrastructure will be created. So let's sit here and watch this for a few minutes. Now that it's completed, let's go and take a look at our process. So Docker compose PS. We can see that the task is running, and we see an endpoint here that's a load balancer. So let's grab this load balancer and just do a curl against that load balancer. And now we get hello world. So our application is up and running behind a load balancer in Amazon ECS. You might be thinking, I don't really want to parse out the pretty print from this Docker compose PS. Well, what we can do is Docker compose PS and then do -- format JSON. And here we can get a JSON blob, and then we could go through and parse out from here what our endpoint really is, which in this case, the URL is this Java load balancer endpoint. Now that we have this running, we want to go ahead and shut it down so we can do our next step, which will be using Jenkins to actually do everything that we just did in a single Jenkins file. So to do that, we run Docker compose down. Now that everything is cleaned up within AWS, let's take a look at the Jenkins file that we're going to be using for the rest of our example. So let's go back over to our repository, which is right here, and we'll go back to the root. And let's take a look at, let's get to the Docker Compose one, and let's take a look at Jenkinsfile 2. So we're adding in some environment variables here for credentials, for Docker Hub credentials, AWS credentials, and keychain, which I'll talk about in just a second. So we did a Docker login earlier, so we need to have login credentials available for our Docker login. Here are our AWS credentials. These are being provided by the AWS credentials plugin. And this keychain password. This is going to be a secret text that is going to be the password of my login for my Mac. So my username is dpope. That's already known, but all that we need for unlocking the keychain is just the password. So we don't have to give it the full username and password, just a password. So that's the reason why I chose secret text for that one. Now, you might be asking, okay, why are you unlocking and at the end, locking the keychain? A number of these commands need access to the keychain on the Mac. So if you're doing this on Windows or on Linux, these two keychain steps would not be necessary. But because I'm doing this on a Mac, I need to do this. Also, from a security perspective, this isn't the greatest thing to do is do an inline version of the password, but the security binary only gives me that option. I cannot pipe in the password to this, at least not cleanly. So for this example, I'm doing this in a not good practice way, but at least you'll be able to see how it works. We left the tooling versions up here at the top just to make sure everything's good. And let's look at our steps that really matter here. Docker context use default. So in order for us to do a build and a push, we need to be on our default context. The only thing we care about using the context for, which in this case I have a poorly named one, so let's go ahead and fix that, because I changed the name of our context to my ECS context. So let's go ahead and fix this. Normally, I would have had this done correctly, but live coding. Here we go. ECS context. There we go. Let me do a git add here and git commit-m fix and git push. And if we take a quick look at this now, we now have my ECS context because that is the context that we have on this machine. Just to make sure, context ls, and it is named my ECS context. Now you might be saying to yourself, Darren, why aren't you creating the context here? Honestly, I'm just being lazy. Because I know this agent already has the context set up correctly, I am going to make the assumption that the context is correct. So if it wasn't there, this would fail. Next up, we would say Docker Compose up, like what we just did by hand, and then we run our Docker Compose PS format JSON. That way we're able to pull out and see what our load balancer is. And then at the very end, always we're relocking the keychain. So during the process, we unlock the keychain, and always, no matter what, we always lock it back up. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to set up some credentials first. So let's go back over to our controller, dashboard. We got logged out, so let's log back in. Let's go to Manage Jenkins. Let's go to Manage Credentials. And let's go ahead and create 3 credentials here. So add credentials. The first one that we're going to create is of type user password. And this is going to be for our Docker Hub credentials. So that's just a username password. That's all we're going to need for that. So username is, we saw before, Darren Pope. And then my password is that, which you cannot see. Next up, we're going to add our AWS credentials. So AWS, the ID for this one matches our Jenkins file. And you have already seen these credentials, both the ID and the secret. But again, by the time you're watching this, these are no longer valid. Click OK. And then finally, actually here, let me go back and check because it looked like something was incorrect there. Update. Yep, these credentials are valid to have access to 6 availability zones. Again, if you haven't watched the AWS credentials plugin video, go watch that. That explains what this is about. Okay, final one. Let's go back and create one more. And this is for the keychain. And we're going to select secret text, ID, description, and then I'm going to type in my password. Okay, so now I have all 3 credentials that I need to support my Jenkins file. Let's wait and see what happens. Now, through the magic of video, we'll fast forward through a very large part of this. So let's go ahead and start the build right now. And let's take a look at the log. Okay, now the job is finished. Let's go and see if the app is actually running. So let's grab this URL and let's go here. Let's see what happens. Now, sometimes it can take a couple of minutes for the application to become available between the load balancer waking up and getting the routing all in place. So don't be surprised once a job completes that the application isn't running just yet. So give it a couple of minutes. Let's see what happens here. And there you can see, finally, our application is up and running and we see hello world. Sometimes you really just don't even need Kubernetes. Sometimes you just have an image that you just need to run. And by using Docker Compose and deploying to Amazon ECS, that pairing makes it possible just to take that image and go run an application. Maybe that's all that you need. Spend some time going through Docker Compose and understanding how it integrates with Amazon ECS. And then once you figure out the steps that you need to do, then take those steps and orchestrate them within Jenkins by using a Jenkinsfile. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to us on Twitter at CloudBeesDevs. If this video was helpful for you, please go ahead and give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to CloudBees TV yet, why not? Take a moment, click on that subscribe button, and then ring that bell, and you'll be notified anytime there is new content available on CloudBees TV. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.